He came to the arbitration dressed for a celebration. That was the first thing Nadia noticed when she stepped into the 41st floor conference room of Mercer and Wyndham Associates. Her husband of 11 years was wearing the navy suit she had picked out for him in Florence. The one she'd spent 40 minutes choosing because the light in the shop made his eyes look kind. He sat at the far end of the polished table with a woman beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The woman's name was Tessa Aldrich. Nadia had learned it 6 months ago from a hotel receipt she hadn't been meant to find. She walked in wearing a gray blazer and carrying a leather folder. She sat down. She did not look at Tessa. She looked at her husband. "Nadia," he said. His voice was careful, the way a man's voice gets when he's rehearsed what to say. She did not answer. She opened the folder and placed it on the table with both hands flat and steady, and she thought, "I have waited 11 years to be underestimated in this room. I will not waste it." His name was Conrad Whitfield. He was 44 years old, the founder and majority stakeholder of Whitfield Strategic Capital, a private equity firm that had recently been ranked among the top 20 in North America. His photograph appeared in Forbes. He gave keynotes at Davos. He donated generously to causes that photographed well. He was the kind of man who had learned early that charm was a form of currency, and he had never stopped spending it. He had met Nadia when she was 29 and he was 32. She had been a financial analyst at a mid-size investment bank, working 70-hour weeks and eating dinner at her desk. He had come in as an external consultant. He had watched her present a risk model for 40 minutes before asking her to dinner. She had said no 3 times. The 4th time she said yes, because he had finally stopped performing and simply said, "I think you're the most precise person I've ever met, and I would like very much to sit across from you somewhere without a conference table." She loved him for years before she understood that precision was not what he actually wanted from her. She left her career when the firm expanded internationally, and Conrad asked her to relocate with him to London, then to Singapore, then back to New York. She had not resented the moves. She had been building something alongside him. Not just a marriage, but a partnership. She helped him structure his first major fund. She reviewed contracts at midnight. She sat with him in the dark after the 2016 market correction and walked him through every scenario with a legal pad and a glass of water until his hands stopped shaking. She was the one who suggested the firm pivot toward infrastructure and healthcare, a strategy that tripled their portfolio value in 4 years. She did not put her name on any of it. She did not need to, or so she believed. The first time she noticed something had shifted, she was standing in the kitchen of their Greenwich home, watching Conrad take a call in the garden. He was laughing. Not his boardroom laugh, which was clean and strategic. This was the other one. The laugh she used to hear when they were new, when he still had things to prove to her. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Then she went back to making dinner, because she had taught herself to wait before drawing conclusions. She waited, she watched, and then she found the receipt. Lowell House Hotel, Chicago. 1 suite, 4 nights. The dates matched a conference he had attended alone because she'd had a commitment in New York she could not reschedule. She had not confronted him immediately. Instead, she called her college roommate, a woman named Petra, who was also a family law attorney, and she said, "I need to know how to protect myself before I say anything." Petra said, "Then come to my office first." Nadia spent 3 months quietly. She organized documents. She pulled financial records. She remembered things Conrad had told her and cross-referenced them with things she had discovered. She found a series of transfers to a subsidiary called Crestline Advisors LLC, a company she had never heard of, which turned out to hold real estate assets including a condominium in the West Village and a lakefront property in Michigan that Conrad had told her belonged to an investor client. They were in his name only. The Crestline transfers had begun 14 months ago. She noted the date. 14 months ago was when Tessa Aldrich had joined Whitfield Strategic Capital as Director of Business Development. Nadia said nothing. She waited for the divorce papers to arrive because she had already known, months before Conrad sat her down in the living room with rehearsed gentleness, that they were coming. She had kissed him on the cheek that morning and let him believe she was blindsided. She cried. Not because she wasn't hurt. She was, in the deep, unreachable way that only comes from loving someone you also trusted. But because grief and strategy are not mutually exclusive, and she had learned long ago how to do two things at once. Now she sat across from him in a room full of lawyers, and she placed a second document beside the first. Before we begin, her attorney, a composed woman named Leslie Howe, said, "We'd like to address a matter of incomplete financial disclosure." Conrad's lead counsel, a heavy-set man named Stratton, leaned forward. "We submitted a full asset inventory in accordance with. Your inventory omits Crestline Advisors LLC, Leslie said. It also omits the West Village property, the Lakeview Road property in Michigan, and approximately $4.3 million in transferred capital that does not appear in the joint marital asset schedule." The room went very quiet. Conrad looked at Nadia. She was still looking at the table. "Where did you get?" he started. "Additionally," Leslie continued, "we have documentation showing that the Northgate Fund, which Mr. Whitfield has classified as a pre-marital asset, received substantial restructuring input and capital management from Mrs. Whitfield during the marriage, beginning in 2016. We have her handwritten notes, dated correspondence, and 3 former colleagues prepared to testify to her direct contribution." Stratton whispered something to Conrad. Conrad's jaw tightened. Tessa shifted in her seat. She had been quiet since Nadia walked in. She was younger than Nadia had expected, or perhaps younger than Nadia had allowed herself to imagine. She had the particular stillness of a woman who knew she was being watched and had decided to look unbothered. But Nadia noticed her hand had moved from Conrad's arm to her own lap the moment the Crestline documents appeared on the table. "You said the Northgate Fund was separate," Tessa said, very quietly. Conrad did not look at her. Not now. It was the same 2 words, Nadia thought, that men like Conrad always said when inconvenient truths arrived in public. Not here, not now. As if location and timing could reclassify damage. "You told me she had nothing to do with the business," Tessa continued. "You said she was." She stopped herself. "Please," Conrad said, his voice low and controlled. Tessa folded her hands on the table. She looked at Nadia. For a moment neither woman spoke. Nadia had imagined this meeting many ways. In some versions she had felt victorious, in others she had fallen apart. But sitting here now, with her hands steady, and the documents laid out, and the silence doing the work she had spent months preparing for, she felt something more complicated than triumph. She felt clear. Like a window that has finally been cleaned after years of built-up residue. Stratton called for a recess. Leslie agreed with conditions. In the hallway, Nadia stood at a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Midtown. The city below moved without knowing or caring about the particular ruin being administered on the 41st floor. She liked that. She liked the anonymity of grief in a large place. Leslie came to stand beside her. "You held up well in there." "I've been holding up for longer than he knows," Nadia said. She thought about the last real conversation she and Conrad had that wasn't about the firm, the schedule, the social calendar, or the quiet tension between them that had calcified into habit. It had been 2 years ago on a Tuesday in February. A snowstorm had shut down the city, and they had stayed home and made soup and watched a documentary about deep-sea creatures. And Conrad had fallen asleep on the couch with his head near her knee, and she had sat very still for an hour, not wanting to disturb him, because it was the most peaceful he had looked in months. She had not known then that Tessa had already happened, but she thought about it now, in the hallway, and she let herself feel the specific ache of retroactive loss. The realization that something was already broken at a moment you thought it was simply quiet. She did not cry. She had already cried. Crying was something she had done at home, alone, in measured doses, because she was not willing to arrive in this room with red eyes and shaking hands, and let Conrad Whitfield interpret that as weakness. She pulled out her phone and texted her sister 2 words, "Still standing." Her sister, who had driven her to her first attorney consultation and waited 3 hours in a coffee shop without being asked, replied immediately, "Of course you are." Back inside, the dynamic had shifted. Stratton's posture had changed. Conrad was speaking quietly to him with his hand over his mouth. Tessa sat slightly apart from both of them now, her chair turned a few degrees toward the door, as if she was already calculating the distance. Leslie placed a third document on the table when they reconvened. This is a financial communication between Mr. Whitfield and his finance director, dated approximately 9 months ago. She let the silence breathe. It reads, "Move the Crestline assets before the disclosure window. Nadia's side won't have time to pull the transfer records if we finalize before March." Conrad's face went very still. Stratton said, "I'd like to know the provenance of that document." Leslie said, "I'd like to address that after we discuss whether your client wishes to proceed with his original settlement offer." Conrad looked at Nadia for the first time since the recess. Really looked at her. She did not look away. She remembered the moment she had stopped being afraid of this day. It had happened late at night, about 4 months ago. Sitting at the desk in the small home office she had converted from a guest room. She had been organizing a folder of financial records, and she came across a photograph that had been tucked into a manila envelope. A printout from a firm anniversary dinner 3 years ago. Conrad was at the center of the image, surrounded by colleagues, laughing. And there was Nadia, slightly to the left, also laughing, holding a glass of champagne she didn't remember drinking. She looked happy. She had been happy. Not performing it. Actually happy in that specific moment, which meant the grief she was carrying now was not for a marriage that had always been broken, but for one that had been real until it wasn't. That was a harder kind of grief to carry, but she had carried it, and she was still carrying it, and it had not broken her into anything less than herself. She put the photograph back in the envelope. Then she went back to the documents. That night, an email arrived from an address she didn't recognize, no subject line. 2 paragraphs and 6 attachments. She almost didn't open it. The first paragraph said, "I'm not asking for your forgiveness and I'm not expecting a reply. But there are things in these files that you deserve to have. I was told a version of you that made it easy to stay. I don't believe that version anymore." The second paragraph said, "The wire transfer schedule in attachment 3 was his idea. I argued against it. That argument is in my inbox. I've forwarded it to your attorney. The sender's email, when Nadia looked it up, was registered to Tessa Aldrich." Nadia sat with her laptop in the dark for a long time. Then she forwarded everything to Leslie with a single line. "We need to talk tomorrow morning." What followed was not dramatic. That was the part no one told you about the legal unraveling of a marriage. It was mostly paper, mostly waiting, mostly procedural language delivered in conference rooms that all smelled the same. But the paper mattered. The paper was what turned a generous-looking settlement offer into something equitable. The paper was what established that the Northgate Fund restructuring had been a joint enterprise, that the transferred assets were marital property, that the concealment had been deliberate. Leslie filed a motion for expanded discovery. Conrad's board learned of the investigation before Conrad could contain the story. 2 limited partners in the fund asked for a meeting. A profile that had been scheduled for publication in a financial magazine was quietly delayed. Conrad called a crisis communications consultant. Conrad called his college roommate, who was a senator. Conrad called his mother, who called Nadia, and Nadia very calmly said, "I love you, Margaret, and I'm sorry this is painful, but I am going to protect what I built." Conrad did not call Nadia. He called Leslie. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When Leslie called Nadia afterward, her voice was matter-of-fact, but her words were not. "They want to renegotiate," she said. "They're offering the Connecticut house, a revised share of the investment portfolio, and they're removing the Northgate carve-out." Nadia looked out the window of the apartment she had rented in Brooklyn. Small, sun-filled, with a view of rooftops and water towers and the particular gray-blue sky of a New York winter. "What about the Aldrich testimony?" she asked. "If they concede the asset question, we may not need it." "Keep it on the table," Nadia said. "I want him to know it exists." The final settlement meeting took place on a Thursday in January. Leslie and Stratton did most of the talking. Conrad sat across from Nadia for 2 hours without speaking to her directly. Once, when Stratton was reviewing a clause, Conrad looked at her the way he used to look at complicated models, searching for the logic of a thing he hadn't anticipated. She thought he was trying to find the moment he had miscalculated. She thought he might be looking for the version of her that he had expected to be there, the quiet one, the supportive one, the one who would accept the first offer because she would not know to ask for more. She let him look. She said nothing. She had already said everything that needed to be said in documents. When it was over and the papers were signed, Nadia walked out of the building alone. The January air was cold and bright. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let herself feel it. She called her sister. "Done," she said. Her sister said, "Tell me where you are. I'm coming to get you." They went to a diner in the Cobble Hill neighborhood because Nadia had been thinking about pancakes for days. They sat in a booth and ordered too much food, and her sister held her hand across the table, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was its own form of grace. "How do you feel?" her sister asked finally. Nadia thought about it. "Lighter," she said, "and very, very tired." She took possession of the Connecticut house that spring. It was a rambling old colonial set back from the road on 3 acres of land that included a long neglected greenhouse she had once planned to restore. She had fallen in love with it on a rainy afternoon 6 years ago, when the realtor let them in through the back, and she had stood in the greenhouse with rain tapping the glass ceiling and thought, "I want to make something grow here." Conrad had liked the property because it signaled the right things. She had loved it because of the greenhouse. She spent the first weeks learning what the house actually was rather than what she had imagined it to be. The old boiler made noise. A section of the back fence needed replacing. The greenhouse glass was intact but filthy, and the planting beds had gone to seed. She hired a contractor, a neighboring woman who came recommended, and on the first morning they walked the property together, and the woman said, "What do you want to do with all this?" Nadia looked at the greenhouse. "I want to start with what can still be saved." She went back to work. Not immediately, and not in the same form. She had stayed out of the industry long enough that returning meant starting smaller than where she'd left, which she had expected, and which did not frighten her. She reached out to former colleagues. She took a consulting engagement with a healthcare infrastructure fund. Exactly the kind of work she had helped develop inside Whitfield Strategic, now formalized under her own name. The engagement led to another. She hired an assistant. She wrote a 2-page strategic memo that circulated in a small professional network and led to a speaking invitation at a conference in Boston. At the conference, in the green room, she met a woman named Ren Solano who ran a small impact investment firm and who had read the memo twice and highlighted both pages. They talked for 40 minutes before they were due on stage together. By the end, they had agreed to have dinner. By the end of dinner, they had agreed to talk weekly. Ren would later say that the thing she noticed first about Nadia was her patience. Not passivity, she was never passive, but a quality of stillness that made you feel she was actually listening, rather than preparing her next sentence. "Most people in finance want to be heard," Ren said. "Nadia wants to understand." Nadia had learned the difference the hard way. Conrad reached out once, 4 months after the divorce was finalized. A brief message, professional in tone, asking if she would be open to a conversation. She read it twice, then forwarded it to Leslie with a question, and Leslie said there was no legal reason she couldn't respond, but no obligation either. She typed a reply. She read it over. She deleted it. She wrote another one. 3 sentences. "I hope you're well. I don't think a conversation would be useful for either of us right now." "I wish you clarity," he replied within minutes. "You were always more generous than I deserved." She closed her laptop and went to check on the greenhouse. She had planted herbs along the south wall in early April. By June, the basil had taken over its allotted section. There were 3 varieties of tomatoes trained up the trellis, and a rosemary bush in the corner that her neighbor said was indestructible. She went in most mornings before work and spent 20 minutes with her hands in soil and her mind empty. It was the best part of her day. She did not know that summer whether she had forgiven Conrad. She thought about it sometimes, standing in the greenhouse with morning light coming through the glass, and she decided that forgiveness was not the organizing question. The organizing question was, who was she now, without the weight of a life built around someone else's ambitions? And the answer arrived slowly, the way answers to real questions do, not as revelation, but as accumulation. She was precise, she was patient. She was harder to deceive than she used to be, and she had made peace with the fact that this was both a loss and a gain. She was a person who had walked into a room designed to reduce her and had left it with more than she'd been offered. She was a person who owned a greenhouse. In September, Wren's firm extended a formal partnership offer. Nadia sat with it for a week. She called her sister. She called Leslie, not for legal advice, just to talk to someone who had seen her at her most frightened and had continued to believe she was capable of more. She walked the property late one evening when the light was going orange over the tree line, and she thought about what it meant to build something with someone who saw your value, not because you had subordinated yourself to theirs, but because you had shown up as yourself. She called Wren on a Sunday morning. "Yes," she said, "let's do it." She had loved Conrad Whitfield. That was not something she was prepared to revise or erase. Love did not become counterfeit simply because the person could not sustain it. She had loved him with her eyes open and her intelligence intact and her whole self present. And if he had not been able to receive that without diminishing it, the failure was his, not hers. But she had also loved herself, not always, not without effort, but enough. Enough to wait before she spoke. Enough to protect herself before she confronted him. Enough to sit in a conference room with her hands flat and her face steady, while the documents did what she could not do with anger alone. The greenhouse had its first proper harvest in October. Her neighbor came over with a bottle of wine, and they sat at the kitchen table with plates of roasted tomatoes and bread and talked until it was dark outside. Her sister came on the weekend and they made soup and walked the property, and her sister stopped at the greenhouse door and looked in and said, "You really did this." "I really did," Nadia said. There was a version of the story that centered on Conrad's fall. The board review, the limited partners who quietly reduced their commitments, the Forbes profile that never ran, the deal in Singapore that fell through when the counterparty conducted enhanced due diligence. Those things happened. She knew they happened because Leslie told her, and because the financial press, if you knew where to look, told a careful story between the lines. But that was not the story Nadia told herself. The story she told herself was about a woman who had entered a marriage believing that love and intelligence together were enough to sustain anything. Who had learned, expensively and slowly, and then all at once, that they were not without honesty, not without being seen as a full person rather than a useful one. Who had walked into the hardest meeting of her life alone, without anger as her primary weapon, with only the truth carefully organized in a leather folder, and had come out of it owning the home she had always loved, and the career she had set aside, and the name she had been born with, Nadia Reyes. Her name, her whole name, returned to her own professional correspondence. She was 38 years old. She had not stopped being afraid of things. She was afraid of failing the partnership, afraid of loneliness on long winter evenings, afraid sometimes that she had used the best years of her love on someone who had not earned it. But she had learned that fear was not an argument against action. She had learned that quiet was not the same as powerless. She had learned that the people who tried to erase you usually failed, not because of some cosmic correction, but because the erased have a way of keeping their own records. She kept hers. And when spring came again, and the greenhouse filled with its second season of green, and the morning light came through the glass at the exact angle that made everything look provisional and possible, Nadia Reyes stood inside it with her hands in the dirt and her mind her own, and that was enough. More than enough. That was everything.